Rediscovery and Resilience, a woman's journey to healing and self-love. Before everything unraveled, there was a silence between us that no one saw. Not the kind that came after arguments or slammed doors. Not even the kind that followed a long day when words had simply run out. No, this silence had been built brick by invisible brick, layered with polite smiles, half-finished sentences, and glances that no longer lingered. We were the kind of couple that looked perfect from across the room. Hands intertwined, laughing at the right moments, leaning toward each other like gravity was still on our side. But beneath all that was a fault line. We used to joke that we were each other's calm in the chaos. That was before the calm turned into emptiness and the chaos stopped knocking. Now, as I look back, I can trace it all to a single moment, insignificant in the moment itself, but monumental in retrospect. It was a Thursday, gray and damp, the kind that didn't belong to any season. I remember hearing the rain tap against the window, soft and consistent, like a forgotten heartbeat. He was in the kitchen, stirring his coffee absent-mindedly, eyes fixed on something I couldn't see. I had just come down the stairs, wearing that old navy sweater he used to steal from my closet. He didn't look up, not even when I walked past him. Not even when I said good morning. That was the first time I felt truly invisible in my own home. The first time I wondered if we'd both slipped into our own worlds without even noticing the departure. But I didn't say anything. I smiled instead, poured my own coffee, and sat across from him, pretending the quiet was comfortable. That day bled into the next, and then the next, and before long, we were two strangers managing a shared calendar, sensing grocery lists, and navigating a choreography of obligation. Birthdays came and went. Anniversaries became muted acknowledgments. Sex became something scheduled, like dental appointments, necessary but forgettable. And yet, we never fought. Not really. I sometimes think fighting would have saved us. At least it would have meant we still cared. What we had was worse. Indifference wrapped in the illusion of harmony. We still held hands in public, still posted vacation pictures, still played the part. I often wondered if he noticed, if he felt the same strange itch I did when we lay side by side, so close and yet so alone. Then one evening, everything cracked. We were watching a movie. I don't remember which one, only that it was loud and violent, and I didn't like it. I said something, maybe a joke, maybe a comment about the actor, and he didn't respond. Not even a glance. That familiar weight settled in my chest, but instead of swallowing it, I asked, "Are you even listening to me?" He paused the movie, looked at me with tired eyes, and said, "Do we really have to do this now?" That was the moment I knew. There was no fight left, no flame to stoke. We weren't two people drifting apart. We had already drifted. We were just too polite to admit it. But the truth is, I hadn't stopped loving him. I had stopped knowing how. And he perhaps had never learned in the first place. Still, I tried, not in grand gestures, but in tiny, desperate ones. I bought his favorite beer, left notes in his car, asked about his day and really listened. I tried to resurrect the woman he once looked at like she hung the stars, but each effort met a wall, a nod, a thanks, a distracted kiss on the forehead. So I retreated. Again, I began to write more. Journal entries turned into letters. Letters I never sent. They filled a drawer in my study, folded neatly like secrets. They were not bitter. They were not pleas. They were just pieces of me, preserved in ink, in case I ever forgot who I used to be. I think that's what scared me most. Not the idea that he didn't love me anymore, but the realization that I was vanishing, shrinking into the margins of my own story. Then came Claire. Or rather, the idea of Claire. I never met her. I only found her name once in his phone, buried beneath a list of missed calls and old group chats. Claire. No last name, no photo. Just a name. I told myself it was nothing, that it could be a colleague, a cousin, a friend. But that night, he smiled at his phone in a way he hadn't smiled at me in years. It was a soft smile. Private. One meant for someone who made him feel seen. And I, who had once been that someone, sat across from him, nodding along to a conversation I wasn't part of. I didn't ask. I didn't accuse. I didn't cry. I just watched him from behind the glass wall we'd both built, wondering when it had become easier to talk to anyone else but me. Days passed. Then weeks. And every time he left the room, I felt a tug, a pull toward that drawer full of letters. I started rereading them, not out of nostalgia, but to remind myself that I was still there. That my voice still existed, even if he no longer heard it. One afternoon, I came home early. The house was quiet. The air felt different, like something had been interrupted. His shoes were gone. So was his jacket, but not just his. His suitcase, the one we used for vacations, was missing too. I checked the closet. A few shirts were gone. His toothbrush. The watch I gave him on our 3rd anniversary. There was no note, no message, just absence and silence. Again, I sat on the edge of our bed, the same bed we'd shared through sickness, laughter, and long winters, and I waited. For an hour, then 2, but I knew, somewhere deep inside, I had known for a long time. When midnight came and he still hadn't returned, I opened the drawer, took out the letters, every last one. I read them aloud, one by one, to the empty walls until my voice cracked and the tears finally came. They weren't tears of heartbreak. They were tears of release, of waking up. I didn't call anyone, didn't tell my friends, didn't even text him. Instead, I did something unexpected. I booked a train ticket, north, to the town I used to visit as a girl, a place with pine trees, wind chimes, and quiet. A place that didn't ask me to be anything but myself. As the train pulled away the next morning, I looked back only once. Not at the house or the street, but at the version of me I was leaving behind. The woman who waited, who tried, who disappeared. And I whispered goodbye, not to him, but to the life I no longer belonged in. What came next wasn't healing. Not yet. It was solitude, and in that solitude, I would begin to remember what it meant to be whole. But I didn't know that then. All I knew was that the silence had finally broken, and for the first time in years, it was mine. The town I chose wasn't extraordinary by any standard. It wasn't the kind of place you'd find on postcards or Instagram feeds. No dramatic cliffs or quaint stone bridges, just a handful of wooden houses stitched into the slope of a hill, a lake that mirrored the sky too perfectly to trust, and a single road that curled like a ribbon through the pines. It was the quiet I needed, the kind that didn't feel empty but protective, like the universe holding its breath just long enough for me to catch mine. I rented a small cabin near the edge of the woods, one with creaky floors, uneven windows, and a fireplace that smelled of stories long since told. The woman who owned it, Agnes, had silver hair and eyes that seemed to understand loss without asking questions. She handed me the keys, pressed a hand to mine, and said, "People come here when they want to forget, but it's remembering that sets them free." I didn't answer. I couldn't. My words still felt too fragile to trust. The first days blurred. I walked, a lot, through pine needles that whispered underfoot, beside streams that never seemed to repeat themselves. I let the cold wind sting my cheeks, welcomed the way it made me feel raw, real. I didn't check my phone. I didn't read the news. The only messages I read were the ones I'd written to myself in those unsent letters, which I brought along like relics from another life. In the mornings, I would make coffee and stare out the fogged window, waiting for some invisible sign that I'd done the right thing. Sometimes I imagined he'd call, that he'd leave a voicemail full of apologies, explanations, maybe even tears. But none came. Not on the first day. Not on the 5th. Not on the 10th. It was as though I'd never existed in his world at all. At night, I lay in bed, tracing the wooden planks above me, pretending each knot in the wood was a different version of myself. The one who stayed. The one who fought. The one who forgave. I didn't cry much. That surprised me. It wasn't that I wasn't hurting. I was. But the pain was quieter than I'd expected, like a river running deep under ice. I didn't realize how numb I'd grown until one morning, I found myself staring at my own reflection in the cabin's tiny bathroom mirror, repeating my name aloud over and over, like a spell I couldn't remember the meaning of. Who was I now without him? Without us? Without the story I'd told myself for years. The answer didn't come quickly, but something else did. On my third week in the cabin, I started writing again. Not letters this time, but something freer, messier. Paragraphs with no punctuation. Pages with ink smudges and crossed outlines. I wrote about the silence, the rain, the way his absence had taken up more space than his presence ever did. I wrote about the night we met, how he made me feel seen in a way that now felt like a trick mirror. I wrote until my hand itched and the paper curled with breath. It didn't fix anything, but it gave me shape. One morning, I found a book in the cabin's shelf, The Geography of Longing. I opened it, expecting nothing, but inside the cover was a name of Claire, handwritten, in the same handwriting I'd once seen on a small note left beside his keys. My stomach dropped. Claire, the name from his phone, the smile he gave to someone else. And now, somehow, she was here too. Or at least, had been. I reread the name again and again, as if the loops of ink might unlock some new understanding. Was this coincidence, or fate playing a cruel joke? I tried to laugh, but it caught in my throat. That night, I lay awake, book in hand, flipping pages that suddenly felt heavy. And then something strange happened. I started to feel curious. Not about her, but about the way our lives might have brushed against each other like shadows on a wall. Did she come here to forget him too? Or someone else? Was she the storm that tore us apart? Or was she caught in it just like me? The not knowing didn't hurt as much as I thought it would. In fact, it was freeing, because it meant the story I'd built around him, around us, was never the whole truth. It was only my version, my half. And maybe that's why it had collapsed. A relationship built on halves will always be searching for its missing pieces. As the days wore on, the lake began to thaw. Birds returned. The pine trees seemed less solemn. I met a man once on a walk. His name was Ely. He had a camera slung over his shoulder and a way of asking questions that didn't feel invasive. We talked about trees, about the color green, about how some places feel familiar even if you've never been. I didn't tell him anything real. Not yet. But I noticed the way he listened, not to respond but to understand. It reminded me of who I used to be when I still believed people were worth knowing. He didn't ask why I was there. He didn't mention the bookshop he said he ran. He just walked beside me for a while, and when he left, he smiled with his eyes. I thought about that smile all evening. Not because it made me feel something new, but because it made me feel it all. The next morning, I returned to the trail, not to find him, but to find myself in that space again. Open, curious, alive. I didn't see Ely, but I saw a fox dart across the path. I saw the first crocus of the season. I saw my own breath as I laughed, startled by a bird flying too close. And in those small moments, I saw myself, not as a wife, not as a woman left behind, just me. That night, I built a fire. I poured a glass of wine. I took the book Claire had left behind and read it cover to cover. It was beautiful, sad in a way that didn't demand pity. It was about longing, yes, but also about maps and how we try to chart the unknowable terrain of human connection. At the end, there was a line that stopped me. We don't lose people. We lose the versions of ourselves we became with them. I read it again and again, because that was the truth I had been circling. I hadn't lost him. Not really. I'd lost the version of me who needed his gaze to feel real, and that was the version I was ready to leave behind. The next day, I walked into town. I bought new journals. I sat by the lake and sketched without caring how it looked. I waved at strangers. I started to belong, not to a person, but to a place. A rhythm. A life. I did not call him. I did not check for messages. I no longer waited for closure, because closure is just a name we give to endings we want to control. Real healing is messier. It leaves scars in odd places. It teaches us that sometimes the only way out is through. One evening, I stood at the edge of the lake, the wind wrapping around me like an old song. I thought of the woman who had whispered goodbye on a train. She had been brave not because she left, but because she dared to face the silence. I closed my eyes. I whispered something new. Thank you. Not to him, not to Claire, to myself, for surviving, for beginning again. And somewhere in the space between stillness and breath, I knew this was not the end of the story, it was the middle. And for the first time in years, I was no longer afraid of what came next. Spring crept in slowly, as if the forest around the cabin was unsure whether it was safe to exhale. Snow still clung to the northern slopes, but the lake had shed its armor of ice and lay open, waiting. The days stretched longer, warmer, and I began to forget the number of weeks I'd been gone. Time had softened its edges out here, and so had I. My hair grew wild. My nails bore earth beneath them. I stopped wearing a watch. Some days, I woke before dawn and sat outside, wrapped in an old wool blanket, watching the mist unravel over the water like breath. It was in these quiet mornings that something stirred deep within me. Not joy exactly, but something adjacent. I started calling it returning. Not to a place, to myself. I began noticing the things I used to ignore. The tilt of a bluebird's head. The way moss clung to bark like a secret. The way my chest felt unclenched. I wasn't healed. Not yet. But I was no longer bleeding. There's a difference. Grief had stopped knowing and had become a dull hum, like a song you don't quite remember but can't forget. I lived with it. I let it be. Illy showed up again one Thursday. I was hauling firewood into the cabin when I heard footsteps behind me. "You're still here," he said, like it was both a surprise and a relief. I nodded, brushing hair from my face. He had his camera again. This time he asked if he could take my photo. I hesitated. "Not for anything," he said quickly. "Just you look like you're finally breathing." It wasn't vanity that made me agree. It was curiosity. I wanted to see myself through someone else's lens, someone who hadn't watched me fade. He didn't pose me, just waited as I turned toward the light, firewood still in my arms, breath visible in the crisp air. He clicked once, then lowered the camera. "Got it?" he said, then smiled as if he understood something I didn't yet. We didn't talk about relationships. Not his, not mine. We talked about the stars instead. How out here, you could see the constellations like bright, broken maps. We talked about places we'd been, books we'd never finished, how the world felt tilted lately, like something had shifted and no one had quite noticed. There was no flirtation, no pressure, just the soft cadence of two people orbiting quietly. No gravitational pull yet, only proximity. One evening, he invited me to the bookshop. It was tucked behind the bakery, smelling of pine and paper. There was a bell that didn't ring and a cat named Marbles that didn't move. I sat on the floor between shelves while he restocked new arrivals. I told him about the book Claire had left and how I'd found her name inside it. He paused, a book in hand, and said gently, "Maybe it was meant for you. Maybe people leave pieces of themselves behind so others can pick them up and carry them somewhere new." That night, I dreamed of oceans, of holding someone's hand I couldn't see, standing on the edge of a boat that never moved. When I woke, my hand was curled into a fist, palms sweaty, heart racing. It wasn't flonging. Not for him, not for Ely, but for connection. Honest, raw, uncalculated connection. I wasn't sure I knew how to have that anymore. But I wanted to try. I began writing again, this time with purpose. Not just fragments or memories, but a story. A real one. About a woman who disappears without leaving. About how she becomes a ghost in her own home, only to realize she has to haunt herself before she can return. It wasn't subtle, but it was true. I wrote it in long stretches, sometimes hours without blinking, the fire going out, daylight slipping away. The words poured like confession, not to be forgiven but to be freed. Ailey read the first pages one night by the lake. He didn't say anything afterward, just closed the notebook and handed it back. But later he left a note inside it, "This matters. Keep going." That was the first time I cried in weeks. Quiet tears, grateful ones. Not because of him, but because I realized I wasn't invisible anymore. Someone saw me, and not the broken parts, the becoming. One afternoon, I went back into town and bought a simple gold necklace. Not expensive, not meaningful to anyone else. I bought it because I liked how it shimmered against my collarbone, because it reminded me of softness, of reclaiming. I passed a mirror on the way out of the shop and caught a glimpse of myself. My eyes were brighter, my mouth less guarded. The woman in the reflection didn't look like someone who'd been abandoned. She looked like someone who had chosen herself. I began sending postcards. Not to him, but to old friends, forgotten cousins, even my sister. Short notes. Nothing heavy. Just fragments. I saw a fox today. I learned how to light a fire with one match. I think I'm okay. Most didn't write back. That didn't matter. Writing them felt like proof of life. The weather warmed. Agnes, the woman who owned the cabin, began planting flowers along the path. She gave me a pot of daffodils. New beginnings, she said. I placed them on the windowsill and whispered to them every morning like they were listening. One morning, the phone rang. Not a message. An actual call. The screen lit up with his name. My breath caught. I stared at it as it rang out, vibrating against the wood like a wasp trapped in a jar. I didn't answer. Not out of anger, but because I had nothing left to say. Whatever needed to be known was already written in the silence we'd both chosen. That was our ending. Not a door slammed, not a scream, but the absence of words when we needed them most. He didn't call again. That was the closure I never asked for but received anyway. Later that week, Ellie brought a photograph, the one he'd taken of me months ago. He'd printed it in black and white. In it, I looked fierce and soft at once. I live in a way I hadn't recognized until I saw it frozen in time. I framed it and placed it beside my bed, not out of vanity, but as a reminder that healing isn't something you arrive at. It's something you witness in yourself, slowly, frame by frame. By the end of May, I had a finished manuscript. I printed it, bound it with a simple string. I didn't send it to publishers. Not yet. It wasn't about being read. It was about being real. I asked Ely to read the final chapter aloud. We sat outside, wind threading through the trees. As he read, I watched the lake, unmoved, infinite. When he finished, he looked up and said nothing. Instead, he reached for my hand, not to pull me forward or hold me in place, but to say, I'm here. And for once, that was enough. The days blurred again, but not like before. This blur was gentle, the way light dances through leaves. I began planning a return, not to him, not to the house we shared, but to the world, to whatever came next. I didn't want to stay in the cabin forever. It had done its work. It had sheltered my unraveling, but I was ready to be seen again, to build something new, not on top of ruins, but beside them. Before I left, I buried the letters, all of them, in a small tin box beneath the oldest pine near the lake. Not because I was ashamed, but because I needed them to become part of the soil. I whispered, "Thank you," and walked away with looking back. I didn't say goodbye to Ely. Not properly. We hugged. We exchanged numbers. We smiled in that way people do when they aren't sure if the story is ending or simply pausing. I liked the uncertainty. It meant the future wasn't yet written. I boarded the train with no destination planned, just a map and a window seat. As the forest fell away and cities rose in the distance, I opened my notebook and wrote 5 words that felt like a promise: I am still becoming her. And this time, I meant it. The city greeted me like an old friend I hadn't spoken to in years. Familiar but changed, as if it too had lived through something unspoken. Tall buildings loomed over narrow streets that pulsed with movement. Neon signs blinked above cafes filled with strangers who never looked up. And the constant hum of engines and footsteps reminded me that life didn't stop when I did. It was disorienting after so much stillness, but I had wanted this. I had chosen to return, not to the place I once called home, but to the world itself. To noise, to motion, to the friction of existing again among others. I rented a modest apartment on the 3rd floor of an aging brick building, its windows framed by iron railings and the faint scent of curry drifting in from the restaurant downstairs. The place had flaws: peeling paint, a heater that groaned like an old dog. But I liked it. It didn't pretend to be more than it was. Neither did I. There was a small desk by the window, where I unpacked my journals, a single shelf for books, and a coat hook where I hung the jacket I had worn the day I left him. I no longer needed it for warmth, but I kept it as a reminder that I had once walked away from something that almost consumed me. The city offered anonymity, and I wrapped myself in it like armor. I explored new streets, sat in cafes without ordering anything, wandered through bookstores touching the spines of novels I might never read. Some days I'd walk for hours, watching lives unfold in slivers, a girl chasing a pigeon in the square, a man pacing outside a florist with trembling hands, a woman arguing with her reflection in a shop window. I didn't know their stories, but I started writing them anyway, collecting fragments of strangers and folding them into fiction. It was easier than revisiting my own story. Mine still felt raw, a little too close to the skin. I found a job at a local library, part-time, shelving books and helping children find stories about dragons and invisible friends. It was quiet work, grounding work. I liked the order of it, the soft hush that followed every footstep on the carpeted floor, the way people whispered even when they didn't have to. Sometimes, I would slip one of my own stories between the shelves, anonymous, folded into pages of forgotten novels. I didn't know if anyone read them. That wasn't the point. It was about giving something without expecting it back. The nights were harder. Silence here wasn't gentle like it had been in the cabin. It was louder, heavier. It echoed off the walls and sometimes crept into my chest like a pressure I couldn't name. I tried to fill it with music, audiobooks, cooking shows playing in the background, but nothing softened it completely. One night, I opened a bottle of wine, sat on the floor, and pulled out the photograph Ellie had taken. I studied it for a long time, searching for the woman in it. She looked braver than I felt, steadier. I whispered to her, "Don't go back, no matter how lonely it gets." And somehow, I knew she heard me. A few weeks later, I received a letter. Real paper, handwritten, no return address. The envelope was thin, the writing oddly familiar. I hesitated before opening it. My heart pounded in that old, remembered rhythm, but when I finally unfolded the paper, it wasn't from him. It was from Claire. She wrote simply. No preamble, no apology. Just an acknowledgement. I know we don't know each other, but I know what it's like to love someone who doesn't know how to stay. I found your letter in the book. I hope you don't mind. It made me feel less alone. I left that book behind on purpose. Maybe it found the right hands after all. I read the letter twice, then again. It didn't sting the way I thought it might. It didn't reopen the wound. Instead, it felt like closure from the strangest place. Kindness from someone who was once just a name on a screen. I wrote her back. Didn't sign it, just said, "Thank you for seeing me." I left the letter in the same book, placed it back on the shelf in the bookstore near the station, and walked away. Months passed. I wrote every day now, not to escape, but to explore. I wasn't writing about him anymore. I was writing about women who climbed mountains, who lit fires with their bare hands, who stitched themselves back together with silver thread and stubbornness. I wrote stories with no neat endings, just beginnings wrapped in growth. I started attending a writer's circle on Tuesday nights. A mismatched group of people. Retired professors, disillusioned artists, teenagers who scribbled poems in the margins of their schoolwork. We read each other's work aloud. We gave feedback. We laughed too loudly. And for the first time, I found community that wasn't built on performance or pretending. They knew nothing about my past, and that was liberating. I wasn't someone's ex. I wasn't someone's mistake. I was just a writer. A woman with ink, stained fingers, and a voice that grew stronger with every draft. One night, after reading a short story I'd poured my heart into, an older woman named Ruth approached me. "Your characters," she said, "they age in a way that feels familiar, like they've lived in silence too long." I nodded, not trusting my voice. She leaned in and whispered, "Keep writing. You're telling the truth." That night, I walked home under a pale moon, feeling both small and vast, like I was finally part of something again. Eli and I texted occasionally. Nothing serious. He sent photos of new hikes, his cat curled up on books, odd things he overheard in cafes. I replied with snapshots of rainy streets, library notes left by kids, pages from my notebook. We weren't a love story, at least not then. We were two people who had met in the middle of our unraveling and decided to walk beside each other for a while. That was enough. One morning, while sorting through a pile of returned books, I found a note slipped between the pages of a novel. It wasn't addressed to anyone. Just read, "Sometimes we leave in pieces so we can return whole." I pressed the note against my chest and closed my eyes. The city was no longer overwhelming. It was becoming home. I still had bad days. I still woke up some mornings missing something I couldn't name. But I no longer reached for him. I no longer waited for an apology or dreamed of the version of us that never really existed. I had stopped romanticizing the H. I let it be what it was, a chapter. A necessary one, but not the final. One evening, I stood on my balcony, watching the sun dip below the buildings, the sky bruised with violet and gold. A breeze tangled in my hair, warm and wild, and I thought of the woman I had been. The one who whispered goodbye on a train, who stood at the edge of a lake, who buried her letters beneath pine. She was still with me, not as a memory, as proof. Proof that we can disappear and still find our way back, that we can lose everything and still rise, that we can love deeply and still choose ourselves. And as the city sighed beneath me, I knew the next chapter was already beginning. I didn't know what it held. I only knew that I would meet it fully, pen in hand, heart open, no longer vanishing. Summer arrived slowly, like it had been waiting for my permission. The days grew longer, the air thick with the scent of honeysuckle and pavement heat, and the city pulsed with a rhythm I no longer fought against. I walked through it like someone finally awake, noticing things I would have missed before. The sharp clack of a woman's heels on cobblestone, the blur of a cyclist weaving through traffic, the sound of a saxophone spilling out of an open window at dusk. I let it all in, let it move through me. I didn't want to be numb anymore. I wanted to feel even the sting. The manuscript sat quietly on my desk, no longer demanding attention but waiting with patience. It was done, truly done, and it held a part of me I had never shared before. Not just the story of what had happened, but the voice I had gained because of it. I knew I wasn't the only one who'd felt invisible in their own home, who had smiled while breaking, who had mourned someone still alive and breathing. I started researching publishers. Submitting the manuscript was both terrifying and freeing, like opening the window during a storm and hoping the breeze would lift something instead of tearing it down. One afternoon, I received an email. A small press had read the manuscript and wanted to meet. The editor, Lena, wrote that it felt like a confession whispered through a locked door. Her words stayed with me. I met her at a cafe tucked between a record store and a flower shop, and she surprised me. Young, sharp-eyed, wearing a vintage coat in July and talking with her hands like the truth was always just beyond reach. She told me the book needed polishing, but that the core was rare. "You've lived it," she said. "It shows." The edits began the next week. It was strange cutting into something that had once bled, rearranging wounds and stitching them in cleaner lines. But it didn't hurt, it felt necessary. Like pulling splinters out from under the skin. Lena pushed me to go deeper in places I had glossed over. She wanted more of the silence, more of the unraveling. "Don't protect the reader," she told me. "Let them fall with you." So I did. I rewrote entire chapters not to expose him or even to vindicate myself, but to tell the truth without flinching. Not everything made it in. Some things were just mine, but enough of it lived on the page that I no longer needed to carry it alone. In the meantime, life went on. The library hired me full-time. I started running on early mornings when the streets were still sleepy, chasing the sunrise between buildings like a secret. I made friends. Real ones. A barista who snuck me free muffins. A painter who lived 2 floors down and always smelled of turpentine. Ruth from the Writers' Circle invited me to her garden parties where we read poems aloud under fairy lights strung through apple trees. I wasn't just existing anymore. I was rooted. Ely came to visit in late July. He texted that he'd be passing through the city and asked if I had time for coffee. I stared at the message for a full minute before replying yes. I'd like that. He looked the same when we met. Same camera, same quiet energy. But something in his posture had softened. We sat on a bench by the river, letting the silence stretch comfortably between us before filling it with stories. He told me about a hiking trail that almost killed him, about marbles getting stuck in a laundry basket, about a woman who left him a poem instead of a goodbye. I laughed more than I expected to. At some point, he pulled something from his bag, a small photo book, hand-bound, rough around the edges. Inside were images from the cabin. The lake, the fox, the path where we had walked, and on the last page, the photo of me. He had titled the book Returning. I held it for a long time. It's yours, he said. Always was. We didn't talk about us. There hadn't really been an us, not in the traditional sense. But there had been something quiet and real, something that had helped me remember who I was. When he left the next morning, we hugged longer than usual. He kissed the side of my head just once and whispered, "You're doing it." All of it? I nodded, watched him disappear into the crowd, and then I walked home, heart steady, not broken, not even bruised, just full. As summer deepened, so did my confidence. The book was accepted for publication. The cover design arrived in my inbox one morning, and I stared at for hours, a silhouette of a woman walking into mist, not away from something, but into herself. I cried. Not because I was sad, but because for the first time, I was proud of the person I'd become. Not for surviving, but for choosing not to vanish. I gave a reading at a small local event, hands trembling as I stood behind the mic, words echoing against brick walls and wine glasses. I read a passage about the moment I realized love had stopped being a home and had become a cage. When I looked up, I saw people nodding, some with tears. Afterward, a woman approached me, her voice cracking. I thought I was the only one. And just like that, the story wasn't mine anymore. It belonged to everyone who had ever stayed too long, who had ever confused silence for safety, who had ever left without slamming the door. That night, I sat on my fire escape, the city buzzing below, the manuscript beside me like an old friend. I thought about calling him. Not to reopen anything, but to say thank you for showing me who I wasn't, for giving me the space to become someone else. But I didn't. I had said everything I needed to on the page. Letting go doesn't always look like walking away. Sometimes it looks like never reaching back. Claire sent me another letter. This one was longer. She told me about her life, how she had left too, how she was learning to be alone without being lonely, how she'd found a little peace in unexpected places. She said she was writing again. Not about him. About herself. You reminded me I had a voice, she wrote, and I want to use it. I smiled as I folded the letter, placing it in a box with the others. My story wasn't the only one that had changed. Healing has a ripple effect. One act of bravery sets another free. One voice breaks the silence for many. August came hot and golden. The book's release date was set for the fall. I started working on something new. Not another memoir, but fiction. A novel about reinvention, about a woman who builds a life from broken things and dares to believe it can be beautiful. The words came easier this time. I wasn't writing from a wound anymore. I was writing from a scar, and that, too, was honest. There were still moments when the past tugged at me. A familiar scent, a song on the radio, an old email I forgot to delete. But they no longer undid me. They were reminders, not traps. Traces of a life I had stepped out of, not ones I needed to crawl back into. One evening, walking home, I passed a couple sitting on the curb, legs tangled, laughing too loudly. I felt no bitterness, only recognition. I'd had that once. It had taught me something. And now I knew better. I wasn't bitter. I wasn't broken. I wasn't unfinished. I was becoming, still. Always. Autumn didn't arrive with ceremony, it crept in slowly, changing the light before the temperature, casting the city in amber and rust until I realized one morning that I needed a sweater. The trees outside the library blazed gold and red, their leaves loosening like memories, drifting gently toward the ground with the quiet confidence of things ready to be let go. I watched them from the second-floor window on my break, coffee cooling in my hand, and thought about how far I'd come, not in miles but in truth. Healing hadn't been a straight path, but a spiral. Some days I still woke up with echoes of him. Some nights, I still missed the idea of being held. But what had once felt like grief now felt like gratitude. Not because it hadn't hurt, but because I'd survived it with my soul intact. The book launched on a gray October Thursday. No fanfare. Just a quiet display in the corner of an independent bookstore and a small gathering of readers, some curious, others kind. I wore a navy blue dress that reminded me of the sweater he used to borrow, the one I hadn't worn since the morning he didn't look up. That dress no longer carried sorrow. It carried proof. I stood in front of those strangers, hands no longer shaking, voice low but steady, and I read from the chapter that almost broke me to write. The one about the morning he left without a note, about sitting on the bed waiting for a sound that never came. When I finished, the silence that followed was full, not empty. Someone clapped, then someone else, then everyone. And just like that, it was real. I was real. My story lived outside of me now, and in doing so, it had stopped controlling me. After the reading, I stood by the folding table where copies of the book sat in uneven stacks. A woman approached me, middle-aged, her eyes rimmed with the kind of exhaustion I recognized. "My husband left me while I was asleep," she said. "I thought the silence meant safety. Thank you for showing me it meant something else." I hugged her without thinking. We didn't need to say more. That moment was enough. "Lena sent a text that night you lit something. People will feel it." I smiled, pressing my forehead to the cool glass of the apartment window. Outside, the city continued on, indifferent but vibrant. I had always imagined success would feel like fireworks. But in truth, it felt like peace. A soft click, like something finally sliding into place. And then, a week later, it happened. I saw him. I was crossing the street near the market when I looked up and there he was, standing outside a cafe, looking almost exactly the same. Same jacket, same tilt of the head when he read something on his phone, same distracted air like the world was always slightly out of sync. For a moment, time cracked. My body froze, then flushed. I expected pain. I expected the floor of the world to drop. But it didn't. I stood there, heart racing, watching him like he was a painting I'd stared at too long, familiar, once intimate, now distant. He looked up. Our eyes met. I waited for the shock of recognition in his face. But it didn't come. He looked through me, no, past me, and turned away. Just like that, he didn't see me. Not as in ignoring me. He genuinely didn't recognize me. It was so absurd, so surreal that I laughed, out loud, in the middle of the street. A sound that startled even me. People glanced my way, but I didn't care. I stood there, alone but not lonely, and let the moment pass through me. It wasn't a wound reopening. It was a door slamming shut with finality. I walked home lighter than I'd felt in years. I told no one. That moment wasn't a story. It was a secret between me and the universe. A whispered, "See, you've changed." The next day I received a letter from a reader. A young woman who had fled an emotionally hollow marriage. She wrote that the book had been the first thing to make her feel seen. That she was reading it under a blanket in a new apartment, surrounded by unopened boxes and hope. She signed it with a single word, "beginning." I cried when I read it. Not out of sadness, but because I knew. She wasn't thanking me. She was thanking the version of herself she had chosen to rescue. The bookstore invited me back for a second event, a discussion panel on stories about leaving, loss, and rediscovery. I hesitated. It had all started as a way to reclaim my own voice, not to become a voice for others. But maybe that's what healing does. It transforms what once silenced you into something that sings. Ellie came to the panel. He didn't say anything, just stood in the back, leaning against the wall like he had in the cabin that first day. After the discussion, I found him flipping through one of the books on display. "I came to listen," he said. "I know," I replied. He handed me a folded piece of paper before leaving. I waited until I got home to open it. It was a photo, one I hadn't seen before. Me, sitting by the lake, back turned, hair wild, the sky bleeding pink above my shoulders. On the back, he had written just 4 words: "You were always arriving." I placed it beside the framed portrait on my desk. I didn't text him back. Not because I didn't care, but because some things are perfect in their quietness. Winter crept in again, but this time, I didn't dread the silence. I decorated the apartment with string lights and kept the windows open longer than necessary, letting the cold bite my fingers as I wrote. My second book took shape in long nights and coffee-fueled mornings. It wasn't about him. It wasn't even about me. It was about a woman who planted a garden in the ruins of her home and waited patiently for spring. It was about growth where no one expected beauty. I saw Claire once, by accident or fate. I'll never know. She was sitting in the park, reading. I recognized her from photos I'd found long ago when I had tried to make sense of everything. I almost kept walking, but something pulled me toward her. I didn't introduce myself. I just sat on the bench nearby, opened my book, and waited. She looked over. We held each other's eyes for a moment. She smiled, a real one, and I smiled back. There was nothing to say, no blame, no need. We were 2 women who had walked through fire and emerged different. That was enough. Time continued, as it always does. Some friends faded, new ones stayed. The book sold well enough. I did more readings. I even traveled once, speaking at a retreat for women writers. Each time I told my story, it grew softer around the edges, less about him, more about the choice to return to myself. And then, one cold morning, I realized something. I wasn't waiting anymore. Not for a message, not for closure, not for someone to come back and see me. I had seen myself. I had written myself back into existence. The story had ended long ago. What had continued was the echo, and even that, now, had gone quiet. So I sat at my desk, a mug of tea steaming beside me, and I opened a fresh notebook. No plan, no outline, just a blank page and a steady hand. I wrote the first line slowly, without pressure or fear. It read, "She didn't need the ending to be whole." And it was true. It was always true. Enjoyed the video? Give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, and tap the bell so you never miss an update.